Welcome along to the Journeyman Podcast. This is episode 58. Ever find yourself wondering what actually happens when, two really strong-willed people with totally opposing views just clash head on?
Right, like a proper debate, not just talking points.
Exactly. Well, today we're doing a deep dive into exactly that kind of fiery exchange. It's between Ben Shapiro, the prominent conservative voice, and Andrew Neil, a very seasoned journalist.
And it starts off quite standard, doesn't it? Like Shapiro's there to promote his book.
Yeah, but it escalates fast. Turns into this whole confrontation about bias, the state of political chat these days, and Neil really challenges Shapiro on some past statements.
It gets pretty intense.
Oh yeah. So stick with us because we're going to unpack the key moments. We'll explore what this kind of clash really tells us about, well, the media landscape right now.
And it's fascinating because you see the whole premise just shift, right? It goes from this standard author interview to a real-time argument about, like, journalistic integrity and how much responsibility public figures have for their words.
Totally. We're going to look at how each of them framed their points, the arguments they made, and, the tensions underneath it all that led to, well, a pretty dramatic ending.
Hmm.
And look, this isn't just a quick summary. We've actually gone through an analysis of the interview itself, some commentary from Shapiro afterwards, and the full transcript from that YouTube video. The one titled, Epic Moment, Ben Shapiro Gets Exposed by a Real Journalist.
Right, quite a title.
Yeah, tells you the angle. The link to that original video is in the description, by the way, if you want to check it out yourself. We've basically done the heavy lifting, distilled it all down for you so you get the key insights without, hours of digging.
Save you some time.
Hopefully. So if you find this kind of breakdown useful, please do take a second to like and subscribe to the Journeyman Podcast. It really helps us keep doing these deep dives.
And also definitely check out the Macintosh Team channel on YouTube. Subscribe there too. You can see the original interview we're talking about and other related stuff.
Okay, good shout. Right then, let's get into this interview.
So like we said, the scene is set with Shapiro there, ready to talk about his new book. But Andrew Neil, he pretty much sets a different tone right from the off. Starts questioning Shapiro's established views.
Yeah, and that YouTube video framing we mentioned, it really signals this is going to be confrontational. It says something like, Shapiro's usual rhetoric is met with arguments instead of applause.
Sets the expectation, doesn't it? That this isn't going to be a friendly chat. It's positioned as, Shapiro, this big voice in conservative media, facing a journalist who's really going to push back.
The intro even kind of hints at an intellectual takedown, suggesting Shapiro's going to be tested.
And interestingly, Neil brings up Shapiro's background quite early on, specifically him leaving Breitbart.
Right, and that becomes relevant later, doesn't it, when Shapiro talks about being independent.
Exactly. Shapiro explains he left Breitbart because he felt they didn't adequately support Michelle Fields, a reporter there who alleged she was assaulted by Corey Lewandowski, who was Trump's campaign manager at the time.
Yeah, he basically said Breitbart threw their own reporter under the bus, and this is like a key piece of his whole narrative, right? That he's principled, even if it means leaving a big platform.
And that feeds directly into how he sees his own role in American politics. He talks about filling a void, meeting this hunger for different ideas, because the mainstream media is, in his view, monolithic and left-leaning.
He frames himself as offering an honest take, someone who isn't just towing the Republican Party line.
Says he'll criticize anyone if they violate a principle he holds dear.
But then Neil jumps in, and this is a really key moment. Neil questions whether the right actually has many new ideas, pointing to things like Medicare for all or the Green New Deal coming from the left.
Yeah, that's a direct challenge. And it raises that question of what counts as new in politics. Shapiro pushes back, obviously.
Well, this counter.
Well, he argues those ideas aren't really new, points to historical parallels. And he insists there's actually a lot of vibrant intellectual debate on the right. He mentions things like, nationalism versus patriotism or populism versus free market ideas.
So he's saying the debate is happening, just maybe not where Neil is looking?
Sort of. He even throws in a comment about AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, implying that just because an idea is new doesn't mean it's, good.
Right. But this whole exchange about ideas, it kind of sets the stage for things to get even more heated, doesn't it? The accusations of bias start flying.
Oh, absolutely. This is where Shapiro really goes after Neil's objectivity. He literally asks him, are you an objective journalist or an opinion journalist?
And what prompted that specifically?
It was after Neil described Georgia's anti-abortion laws, which Shapiro supports, as extreme. Neil mentioned the potential for harsh penalties, even for miscarriages or going out of state.
And Shapiro took issue with Neil's language.
Yeah, he challenges Neil for using words like barbaric to describe policies he opposes. Shapiro's point seems to be that this kind of language implies only one side has valid ideas.
And he broadened it out to the BBC too, right? Neil's employer.
He did. He says the BBC purports to be an objective down-the-middle network, but he clearly doesn't think it is. He's basically demanding Neil admit to having a left-leaning bias.
So how does Neil respond to that, being called biased?
Well, Neil defends his role.
Yeah.
He says his job as a journalist is to ask tough questions and present alternatives, especially when someone holds very strong views. He argues he'd do the same to anyone, regardless of their politics.
So it's that classic tension. Is the journalist meant to be a neutral observer or an active challenger?
Exactly, a real clash of philosophies there. But the temperature just keeps rising, because next, Neil brings up Shapiro's own history, some specific controversial statements from his past.
Okay, yeah, this is a crucial part. Let's unpack those. What did Neil bring up first?
He starts with Shapiro, calling President Obama's 2012 State of the Union address evidence of a fascist mentality in action.
Wow. Yeah, fascist mentality is pretty strong stuff.
Definitely. And Neil sort of implicitly questions how that kind of language squares with Shapiro complaining about harsh rhetoric later on.
Okay, what else?
Then he brings up that tweet, the one about Jews who vote for Obama being Jews in name only, or Genos, as Shapiro put it.
Ah, yes, that caused a huge stir at the time. How did Shapiro handle that?
Well, he gives a pretty detailed explanation. He argues that, from his perspective as an Orthodox Jew, American Jews as a group are largely secular or irreligious.
Okay.
So his view was that Jews supporting Obama, whose policies Shapiro saw as harmful to Israel and religious freedom, were prioritizing other things over their Judaism. He actually said they should turn their badge in.
That's a very specific and frankly exclusionary viewpoint, bound to be offensive to many.
Neil certainly presses him on that aspect. And then he moves on to another tweet from 2012.
Which one was that?
The infamous one. Israelis like to build. Arabs like to bomb crap and live in open sewage.
Oof. Yeah, that one's incredibly inflammatory. How did Shapiro respond to that being brought up?
He concedes immediately it was a dumb tweet.
Yeah.
He does try to clarify, saying later tweets specified he meant Hamas leadership, Hamas.
But did Neil buy that clarification?
Not entirely. Neil points out that Shapiro then seemed to broaden it out again, referring to Palestinians more generally, suggesting it wasn't just about Hamas leadership.
So it highlights how hard it is to walk back those kinds of online statements years later, huh?
Absolutely. The context gets debated, but the initial impact lingers. And this whole section leads directly into Neil's big accusation.
Which is?
That Shapiro himself has coarsened public discourse in America and exacerbated its divisions. Neil basically asks him, given your own rhetoric, aren't you part of the problem, not the solution?
Wow, okay. That's putting it directly to him. How does Shapiro react to that charge?
He pushes back hard. He points to Neil's own language in the interview, like calling pro-life policies brutal or like the Dark Ages. Shapiro argues he's all for robust and spirited debate, but objects when people assume bad character in their opponents.
Does he defend his own record on discourse?
Yeah, he mentions times he's criticized his own side, including Trump, and says he engages with people across the aisle. He even brings up his book again, saying it's about the anger in America, this struggle for our national soul.
So there's this meta debate happening. Neil suggesting Shapiro's rhetoric fuels the anger Shapiro writes about, and Shapiro denying it.
Precisely. It really gets to the heart of who bears responsibility for the tone of public conversation. And this leads them into talking about Shapiro's views on Donald Trump.
Right, because his stance evolved, didn't it?
It did. Shapiro explains why he wouldn't vote for Trump back in 2016, mostly tying it back to that Breitbart incident involving Lewandowski and Michelle Fields.
Okay, so principled stand in 2016. But by 2019, when this interview happened,
his position had softened. He says he would certainly consider voting for Trump in 2020. And crucially, he says he would vote for Trump over Joe Biden.
And what was his reasoning for that shift?
Primarily policy. He sort of argued that the damage from Trump's character and rhetoric was already done, baked in, you could say. So the deciding factor for him became policy preference.
Interesting calculation. Did he say anything else about the 2020 race?
Yeah, actually, he offered a kind of interesting take. He thought Joe Biden probably had the best shot of beating Trump among the Democrats.
Why Biden specifically?
He mentioned Biden's potential appeal in the Rust Belt states and his long history in politics, which Shapiro thought made him less vulnerable to attacks compared to maybe newer faces.
So he recognized Biden's strengths as an opponent, but his own vote would still go to Trump based on policy.
That's the picture he painted. And then, well, right after this discussion, things come to a very abrupt end.
The famous walkout moment.
Yeah.
What happened exactly?
Shapiro just seems to reach his limit with Neal's questioning. He states pretty flatly, "I'm not inclined to continue an interview with a person as badly motivated as you as an interviewer."
Wow. Okay. Direct shot at Neal's motives.
Yep. And then he just declares, "So I think we're done here." And that's it. Interview over.
Just like that. And what was Neal's reaction?
Neal gets the last word, and it's dripping with sarcasm. He thanks Shapiro for his time and for showing that anger is not part of American political discourse.
Ouch. Yeah, a really pointed way to end it, referencing that whole theme they'd been discussing.
Definitely memorable.
So, okay, let's try and pull this together. What are the big takeaways from this whole encounter?
Well, I think it really throws the major tensions in political media today into sharp release, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You've got this obvious clash of journalistic styles. You see totally different views on what media bias even looks like.
Yeah, and that fundamental disagreement about political rhetoric, what's acceptable, what's coarse, who's responsible.
Exactly. And also just how past statements get dredged up and dealt with or, sometimes deflected. That's super revealing about how public figures have to navigate their own histories now.
It really felt like Neal was using this direct confrontational approach, constantly challenging.
Very much so. While Shapiro increasingly went on the defensive, questioning Neal's motives, framing it all as this biased attack.
So for you listening, maybe think about this. What does an interaction like this actually tell us about political debate now, especially in the digital age where everything's recorded, everything can be brought back up?
Right. And how do we figure out the motivations, the potential biases of the people giving us information, whether it's a journalist or a commentator?
And that question of responsibility. What role do public figures actually play in setting the tone? How much blame or credit do they deserve for how civil or uncivil our conversations are?
These are tough questions, especially now when everything feels so fragmented and partisan. It leads to maybe the biggest question. In this kind of environment, how can any of us, navigate all these different perspectives effectively? How do we get to a more nuanced understanding of really complex stuff when everything seems designed to push us into opposing camps?
That is the question, isn't it? Something definitely worth pondering. Just a reminder, folks, that link to the original interview transcript is down there in the description.
And yet, do check out the Macintosh Team channel on YouTube and hit subscribe there if you want to see the actual interview footage.
Absolutely. And finally, if you found this deep dive helpful or interesting, please do like and subscribe to us here at the Journeyman Podcast. It lets us know you appreciate these explorations.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for listening.